Chapter 1, Introduction. Part 1, Why Study the History of Philosophy. Number 1. We would scarcely call anyone educated who had no knowledge whatsoever of history. We all recognize that a man should know something of the history of his own country, its political, social and economic development, its literary and artistic achievement, preferably indeed in the wider setting of European and, to a certain extent, even world history. But if an educated and cultured Englishman may be expected to possess some knowledge of Alfred the Great and Elizabeth of Cromwell and Marlborough and Nelson, of the Norman Invasion, the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution, it would seem equally clear that he should know something at least of Roger Bacon and Duns Scotus, of Francis Bacon and Hobbes, of Locke, Berkeley and Hume, of J.S. Mill and Herbert Spencer. Moreover, if an educated man is expected to be not entirely ignorant of Greece and Rome, if he would be ashamed to have to confess that he had never even heard of Sophocles or Virgil and knew nothing of the origins of European culture, he might equally be expected to know something of Plato and Aristotle, two of the greatest thinkers the world has ever known, two men who stand at the head of European philosophy. A cultured man will know a little concerning Dante and Shakespeare and Goethe, concerning St. Francis of Assisi and Fra Angelico, concerning Frederick the Great and Napoleon I. Why should he not be expected also to know something of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes and Spinoza, Kant and Hegel? It would be absurd to suggest that we should inform ourselves concerning the great conquerors and destroyers, but remain ignorant of the great creators, those who have really contributed to our European culture. But it is not only the great painters and sculptors who have left us an abiding legacy and treasure, it is also the great thinkers, men like Plato and Aristotle, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who have enriched Europe and her culture. It belongs, therefore, to a cultured education to know something at least of the course of European philosophy, for it is our thinkers, as well as our artists and generals, who have helped to make our time, whether for good or ill. Now, no one would suppose that it is waste of time to read the works of Shakespeare or contemplate the creations of Michelangelo, for they have intrinsic value in themselves, which is not diminished by the number of years that have elapsed between their deaths and our own time. Yet no more should it be considered a waste of time to study the thought of Plato or Aristotle or St. Augustine, for their thought creations abide as outstanding achievements of the human spirit. Other artists have lived and painted since the time of Rubens, but that does not lessen the value of Rubens' work. Other thinkers have philosophized since the time of Plato, but that does not destroy the interest and beauty of his philosophy. But if it is desirable for all cultured men to know something of the history of philosophic thought, so far as occupation, cast of mind and need for specialization permit, how much more is this not desirable for all avowed students of philosophy? I refer especially to students of the scholastic philosophy who study it as the philosophy of Perennial. That it is the philosophy of Perennial, I have no wish to dispute, but it did not drop down from heaven. It grew out of the past, and if we really want to appreciate the work of St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure or Duns Scotus, we should know something of Plato and Aristotle and St. Augustine. Again, if there is a philosophy of Perennial, it is only to be expected that some of its principles should be operative in the minds even of philosophers of modern times, who may seem at first sight to stand far from St. Thomas Aquinas. And even if this were not so, it would be instructive to observe what results follow from false premises and faulty principles. Nor can it be denied that the practice of condemning thinkers whose position and meaning has not been grasped or seen in its true historic setting is greatly deprecated. While it might also be borne in mind that the application of true principles to all spheres of philosophy was certainly not completed in the Middle Ages, and it may well be that we have something to learn from modern thinkers, e.g., in the field of aesthetic theory or natural philosophy. Number 2. It may be objected that the various philosophical systems of the past are merely antique relics, that the history of philosophy consists of refuted and spiritually dead systems, since each has killed and buried the other. Did not Kant declare that metaphysics is always keeping the human mind in suspense with hopes that never fade and yet are never fulfilled, that while every other science is continually advancing, in metaphysics men perpetually revolve round the same point, without gaining a single step? Platonism, Aristotelianism, Scholasticism, Cartesianism, Kantianism, Hegelianism all have had their periods of popularity and all have been challenged. European thought may be represented as littered with metaphysical systems, abandoned and unreconciled. Why study the antiquated lumber of the chamber of history? Now, even if all the philosophies of the past had been not only challenged, which is obvious, but also refuted, which is not at all the same thing, it still remains true that errors are always instructive, but assuming, of course, that philosophy is a possible science and is not of itself a will-o'-wisp. To take an example from medieval philosophy, the conclusions to which exaggerated realism lead on the one hand, and those to which nominalism led on the other hand, indicate that the solution of the problem of universals is to be sought in a mean between the two extremes. The history of the problem thus serves as an experimental proof of the thesis learnt in the schools. Again, the fact that absolute idealism has found itself incapable of providing any adequate explanation of finite selves should be sufficient to deter anyone from embarking on the monistic path. The insistence in modern philosophy on the theory of knowledge and the subject-object relation should, despite all the extravagances to which it has led, at any rate make it clear that subject can no more be reduced to object than object to subject, while Marxism, notwithstanding its fundamental errors, will teach us not to neglect the influence of technics and man's economic life on higher spheres of human culture. To him especially, who does not set out to learn a given system of philosophy, but aspires to philosophize ab ovo, as it were, the study of the history of philosophy is indispensable. Otherwise he will run the risk of proceeding down blind alleys and repeating the mistakes of his predecessors, from which a serious study of past thought might perhaps have saved him. Number 3. That a study of the history of philosophy may tend to induce a skeptical frame of mind is true, but it must be remembered that the fact of a succession of systems does not prove that any one philosophy is erroneous. If X challenges the position of Y and abandons it, that does not by itself prove that the position of Y is untenable, since X may have abandoned it on insufficient grounds or have adopted false premises, the development of which involved a departure from the philosophy of Y. The world has seen many religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Mohammedanism, etc., but that does not prove that Christianity is not the true religion. To prove that, a thorough refutation of Christian apologetics would be necessary. But just as it is absurd to speak as if the existence of a variety of religions ipso facto disproved the claim of any one religion to be the true religion, so it is absurd to speak as though the succession of philosophies ipso facto demonstrated that there is no true philosophy. We make this observation, of course, without meaning to imply that there is no truth or value in any other religion than Christianity. Moreover, there is this great difference between the true revealed religion and the true philosophy, that whereas the former, as revealed, is necessarily true in its totality, in all that is revealed, the true philosophy may be true in its main lines and principles without reaching completion at any given moment. Philosophy, which is the work of the human spirit and not the revelation of God, grows and develops fresh vistas, may be opened up by new lines of approach or application to new problems, newly discovered facts, fresh situations, etc. The term true philosophy or philosophia perennis should not be understood to denote a static and complete body of principles and applications, insusceptible of development or modification. Part 2. Nature of the history of philosophy. Number 1. The history of philosophy is certainly not a mere congeries of opinions, a narration of isolated items of thought that have no connection with one another. If the history of philosophy is treated only as the enumeration of various opinions, and if all these opinions are considered as of equal value or disvalue, then it becomes an idle tale, or, if you will, an erudite investigation. There is continuity and connection, action and reaction, and thesis and antithesis, and no philosophy can really be understood fully unless it is seen in its historical setting and in the light of its connection with other systems. How can one really understand what Plato was getting at or what induced him to say what he did unless one knows something of the thought of Heraclitus, Parmenides, the Pythagoreans? How can one understand why Kant adopted such an apparently extraordinary position in regard to space, time and the categories unless one knows something of British empiricism and realizes the effect of Hume's skeptical conclusions on the mind of Kant? Number 2. But if the history of philosophy is no mere collection of isolated opinions, it cannot be regarded as a continual progress or even a spiral ascent. That one can find plausible instances in the course of philosophic speculation of the Hegelian triad of thesis, antithesis and synthesis is true, but it is scarcely the task of a scientific historian to adopt an a priori scheme and then to fit the facts into that scheme. Hegel supposed that the succession of philosophic systems represent the necessary succession of stages in the development of philosophy, but this can only be so if the philosophic thought of man is the very thinking of the world spirit. But that, practically speaking, any given thinker is limited as to the direction his thought will take, limited by the immediately preceding and the contemporary systems, limited also, we might add, by his personal temperament, his education, the historical and social situation. Doubtless true, nonetheless he is not determined to choose any particular premises or principles, nor to react to the preceding philosophy in any particular way. Fichte believed that his system followed logically on that of Kant, and there is certainly a direct logical connection, as every student of modern philosophy is aware, but Fichte was not determined to develop the philosophy of Kant in the particular way he did. The succeeding philosopher to Kant might have chosen to re-examine Kant's premises, and to deny that the conclusions which Kant accepted from Hume were true conclusions. He might have gone back to other principles, or excogitated new ones of his own. Logical sequence there, undoubtedly, is in the history of philosophy, but not necessary sequence in the strict sense. We cannot, therefore, agree with Hegel when he says that the final philosophy of a period is the result of this development, and is truth in the highest form which the self-consciousness of spirit affords of itself. A good deal depends, of course, on how you divide the periods and what you are pleased to consider the final philosophy of any period, and here there is ample scope for arbitrary choice, in accordance with preconceived opinion and wishes. But what guarantee is there, unless we first adopt the whole Hegelian position, that the final philosophy of any period represents the highest development of thought yet attained? If one can legitimately speak of a mediaeval period of philosophy, and if Ockhamism can be regarded as the final main philosophy of that period, the Ockhamist philosophy can certainly not be regarded as the supreme achievement of medieval philosophy. Medieval philosophy, as Professor Gilson has shown, represents a curve rather than a straight line. And what philosophy of the present day, one might pertinently ask, represents the synthesis of all preceding philosophies? Number 3. The history of philosophy exhibits man's search for truth by the way of the discursive reason. Thomist, developing St. Thomas's words, all knowers implicitly know God in anything known, has maintained that the judgment always points beyond itself, always contains an implicit reference to absolute truth, absolute being. We are reminded of F. H. Bradley, though the term absolute has not, of course, the same meaning in the two cases. At any rate, we may say that the search for truth is ultimately the search for absolute truth, God, and even those systems of philosophy which appear to refute this statement, e.g., historical materialism, are nevertheless examples of it, for they are all seeking, even if unconsciously, even if they would not recognize the fact, for the ultimate ground, the supremely real. Even if intellectual speculation has at times led to bizarre doctrines and monstrous conclusions, we cannot but have a certain sympathy for and interest in the struggle of the human intellect to attain truths. Kant, who denied that metaphysics in the traditional sense were or could be a science, nonetheless allowed that we cannot remain indifferent to the objects with which metaphysics profess to deal: God, the soul, freedom. And we may add that we cannot remain indifferent to the human intellect's search for the true and the good. The ease with which mistakes are made, the fact that personal temperament, education, and other apparently fortuitous circumstances may so often lead the thinker up an intellectual cul-de-sac, the fact that we are not pure intelligences, but that the processes of our minds may frequently be influenced by extraneous factors, doubtless shows the need for religious revelation. But that should not cause us to despair altogether of human speculation, nor make us despise the bona fide attempts of past thinkers to attain truth. Number 4. The present writer adheres to the Thomistic standpoint that there is a philosophia perennis, and that this philosophia perennis is Thomism in a wide sense. But he would like to make two observations on this matter. A. To say that the Thomist system is the perennial philosophy does not mean that that system is closed at any given historical epoch, and is incapable of further development in any direction. Perennial philosophy, after the close of the medieval period, does not develop merely alongside of and apart from modern philosophy, but develops also in and through modern philosophy. I do not mean to suggest that the philosophy of Spinoza or Hegel, for instance, can be comprehended under the term Thomism, but rather that when philosophers, even if they would by no means call themselves scholastic, arrive by the employment of true principles at valuable conclusions, these conclusions must be looked on as belonging to the perennial philosophy. Saint Thomas Aquinas certainly makes some statements concerning the state, for example, and we have no inclination to question his principles, but it would be absurd to expect a developed philosophy of the modern state in the 13th century, and from the practical point of view, it is difficult to see how a developed and articulate philosophy of the state on scholastic principles could be elaborated in the concrete until the modern state had emerged and until modern attitudes towards the state had shown themselves. It is only when we have had experience of the liberal state and of the totalitarian state and of the corresponding theories of the state that we can realize all the implications contained in the little that St. Thomas says on the state and develop an elaborated scholastic political philosophy applicable to the modern state, which will expressly contain all the good contained in the other theories while renouncing the errors. The resultant state philosophy will be seen to be, when looked at in the concrete, not simply a development of scholastic principle in absolute isolation from the actual historical situation and from intervening theories, but rather a development of these principles in the light of the historical situation, a development achieved in and through opposing theories of the state. If this point of view be adopted, we shall be enabled to maintain the idea of a perennial philosophy without committing ourselves, on the one hand, to a very narrow outlook whereby the perennial philosophy is confined to a given century, or, on the other hand, to an Hegelian view of philosophy, which necessarily implies, though Hegel himself seems to have thought otherwise inconsistently, that truth is never attained at a given moment. Part 3. How to study the history of philosophy. Number 1. The first point to be stressed is the need for seeing any philosophical system in its historical setting and connections. This point has already been mentioned and does not require further elaboration. It should be obvious that we can only grasp adequately the state of mind of a given philosopher and the raison d'être of his philosophy if we have first apprehended its historical point. The example of Kant has already been given. We can understand his state of mind in developing his theory of the a priori only if we see him in his historical situation vis-à-vis the critical philosophy of Hume, of the apparent bankruptcy of continental rationalism and the apparent certainty of mathematics and the Newtonian physics. Similarly, we are better enabled to understand the biological philosophy of Henry Bergson if we see it, for example, in its relation to preceding mechanistic theories and to preceding French spiritualism. Number 2. For a profitable study of the history of philosophy, there is also need for a certain sympathy, almost the psychological approach. It is desirable that the historian should know something of the philosopher. As a man, this is not possible in the case of all philosophers, of course, since this will help him to feel his way into the system in question, to view it, as it were, from inside, and to grasp its peculiar flavor and characteristics. We have to endeavor to put ourselves into the place of the philosopher, to try to see his thoughts from within. Moreover, this sympathy or imaginative insight is essential for the scholastic philosopher who wishes to understand modern philosophy. For instance, if a man, for example, has the background of the Catholic faith, the modern systems, or some of them at least, readily appear to him as mere bizarre monstrosities unworthy of serious attention. But if he succeeds, as far as he can without, of course, surrendering his own principles, having seen the systems from within, he stands much more chance of understanding what the philosopher meant. We must not, however, become so preoccupied with the psychology of the philosopher as to disregard the truth or falsity of his ideas taken in themselves, or the logical connection of his system with preceding thought. A psychologist may justly confine himself to the first viewpoint, but not a historian of philosophy. For example, a purely psychological approach might lead one to suppose that the system of Arthur Schopenhauer was the creation of an embittered, soured and disappointed man who at the same time possessed literary power and aesthetic imagination and insight, and nothing more, as though his philosophy was simply the manifestation of certain psychological states. But this viewpoint would leave out of account the fact that his pessimistic voluntaristic system is largely a reaction to the Hegelian optimistic rationalism, as it would also leave out of account the fact that Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory may have a value of its own, independent of the kind of man that propounded it, and would also neglect the whole problem of evil and suffering which is raised by Schopenhauer's system, and which is a very real problem, whether Schopenhauer himself was a disappointed and disillusioned man or not. Similarly, although it is a great help towards the understanding of the thought of Nietzsche if we know something of the personal history of the man, his ideas can be looked at in themselves, apart from the man who thought them. Number 3. To work one's way into any thinker's system, thoroughly to understand not only the words and phrases as they stand, but also the shade of meaning that the author intended to convey so far as this is feasible, to view the details of the system in their relation to the whole, fully to grasp its genesis and its implications. All this is not the work of a few moments. It is but natural, then, that specialization in the field of the history of philosophy should be the general rule, as it is in the fields of the various sciences. But a specialist knowledge of the philosophy of Plato, for instance, requires besides a thorough knowledge of Greek language and history, a knowledge of Greek mathematics, Greek religion, Greek science. The specialist thus requires a great apparatus of scholarship, but it is essential, if he is to be a true historian of philosophy, that he should not be so overwhelmed with his scholarly equipment and the details of learning, that he fails to penetrate the spirit of the philosophy in question and fails to make it live again in his writings or his lectures. Scholarship is indispensable, but it is by no means enough. But the fact that a whole lifetime might well be devoted to the study of one great thinker and still leave much to be done, this means that anyone who is so bold as to undertake the composition of a continuous history of philosophy can hardly hope to produce a work that will offer anything of much value to specialists. The author of the present work is quite conscious of this fact, and as he has already said in the preface, he is not writing for specialists, but rather utilizing the work of specialists. There is no need to repeat again here the author's reasons for writing this work, but he would like once more to mention that he will consider himself well repaid for his work if he can contribute in some small degree, not only to the instruction of the type of student for whom the work is primarily designed, but also to the broadening of his outlook, to the acquirement of a greater understanding of and sympathy with the intellectual struggle of mankind, and of course to a firmer and deeper hold on the principles of true philosophy. Part 4. Ancient Philosophy. In this volume we treat of the philosophy of the Greeks and Romans. There can scarcely be much need for dwelling on the importance of Greek culture. As Hegel says, the name of Greece strikes home to the hearts of men of education in Europe. No one would attempt to deny that the Greeks left an imperishable legacy of literature and art to our European world, and the same is true in regard to philosophic speculation. After its first beginnings in Asia Minor, Greek philosophy pursued its course of development until it flowered in the two great philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, and later, through Neoplatonism, exercised a great influence on the formation of Christian thought, both in its character as the first period of European speculation and also for its intrinsic value. It cannot but be of interest to every student of philosophy that in Greek philosophy we watch problems come to light that have by no means lost their relevance for us. We find answers suggested that are not without value, and even though we may discern a certain naivete, a certain overconfidence and precipitation, philosophy remains one of the glories of European achievement. Moreover, if the philosophy of the Greeks must be of interest to every student of philosophy for its influence on subsequent speculation and for its own intrinsic value, still more should it be of interest to students of scholastic philosophy, which owes so much to Plato and to Aristotle. And this philosophy of the Greeks was really their own achievement, the fruit of their vigor and freshness of mind, just as their literature and art were their own achievement. We must not allow the laudable desire of taking into account possible non-Greek influence to lead us to exaggerate the importance of that influence and to underestimate the originality of the Greek mind. The truth is that we are far more likely to underrate the originality of the Greeks than to exaggerate it. The tendency of the historian always to seek for sources is, of course, productive of much valuable critical investigation, and it would be folly to belittle it, but it remains true that the tendency can be pushed too far, even to lengths when criticism threatens to be no longer scientific. For instance, one must not assume a priori that every opinion of every thinker is borrowed from a predecessor. If this is assumed, then we should be logically compelled to assume the existence of some primeval colossus or superman, from whom all subsequent philosophic speculation is ultimately derived. Nor can we safely assume that, whenever two succeeding contemporary thinkers or bodies of thinkers hold similar doctrines, one must have borrowed from the other. If it is absurd, as it is, to suppose that if some Christian custom or rite is partially found in Asiatic Eastern religion, Christianity must have borrowed that custom or rite from Asia. So it is absurd to suppose that if Greek speculation contains some thought similar to that appearing in an Oriental philosophy, the latter must be the historical source of the former. After all, the human intellect is quite capable of interpreting similar experiences in a similar way, whether it be the intellect of a Greek or an Indian, without its being necessary to suppose that similarity of reaction is an irrefutable proof of borrowing. These remarks are not meant to depreciate historical criticism and research, but rather to point out that historical criticism must rest its conclusions on historical proofs and not deduce them from a priori assumptions, garnishing them with a pseudo-historical flavor. The legitimate historical criticism would not, as yet at least, seem to have seriously impaired the claim to originality made on behalf of the Greeks. Roman philosophy, however, is but a meagre production compared with that of the Greeks, for the Romans depended in large part on the Greeks for their philosophic ideas, just as they depended on the Greeks in art, and, to a great extent at least, in the field of literature. They had their own peculiar glory and achievements. We think at once of the creation of Roman law and the achievements of Roman political genius, but their glory did not lie in the realm of philosophical speculation. Yet, though the dependence of Roman schools of philosophy on Greek predecessors is undeniable, we cannot afford to neglect the philosophy of the Roman world, since it shows us the sort of ideas that became current among the more cultured members of the class that was master of the European civilized world. The later Stoa, for example, the teaching of Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, affords in many respects an impressive and noble picture which can hardly fail to arouse admiration and esteem, even if at the same time we are conscious of much that is lacking. It is desirable, too, that the Christian student should know something of the best that paganism had to offer, and should acquaint himself with the various currents of thought in that Greco-Roman world in which the revealed religion was implanted and grew. It is to be regretted if students should be acquainted with the campaigns of Julius Caesar or Trajan, with the infamous careers of Caligula or Nero, and yet should be ignorant of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, or the influence at Rome of the Greek Plotinus, who, though not a Christian, was a deeply religious man, and whose name was so dear to the first great figure of Christian philosophy, St. Augustine of Hippo.